lot to say about executions. In Exodus, whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. Whoever kidnaps a person, whether that person has been sold or still held in possession, shall be put to death. Whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. That's my personal favorite. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Then in Leviticus, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. The man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall be put to death. If a man lies with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall be put to death. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, they shall be put to death. If a man takes a wife and her mother also, they shall be burned to death. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he shall be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. Not bad enough you abuse the animal. If a woman approaches any animal and has sexual relations, you shall kill the woman and the animal. Then in Deuteronomy, those prophets and those who bind by dreams shall be put to death for having spoken treason against the Lord your God. If there's a young woman, a virgin already engaged to be married, and a man meets her in the town and lies with her, you shall bring both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman, because she did not cry for help in the town, and the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. But if the man meets the engaged woman in the open country, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who married her shall die. But it's okay to be raped in the country. Now, there are notable exceptions. For instance, King David commits both adultery and murder, and his punishment is not death, or at least not his own. But then there's always been one law for the rich and powerful and another one for everybody else. Remember also that cities of refuge are set up in Israel in early times to shelter accidental murderers. So these are not universal practices, apparently. One of the most famous stories about Jesus that's not in the Bible, nevertheless shows up in numerous manuscripts of Luke and John. The woman caught in adultery falls under Leviticus 20. There's no mention of the man with whom she's committing adultery. And the scribes and Pharisees seek to test Jesus so that they might have some charge to bring against him. That is to say, either Jesus speaks against the law of God that commands the woman to be stoned, or he betrays his own teaching about God's mercy and forgiveness. Instead, it's sort of a classic controversy story. Jesus turns the tables on his opponents. They walk away, and he dismisses the woman, saying, "Go and sin no more." Well, this avoidance of violence accords with what we hear elsewhere from Jesus. In Matthew, he says, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Most important of all, I think, in the New Testament is the testimony to Jesus' own death, which Anna has marvelously introduced us to. Crucifixion is the Roman Empire's most heinous form of execution. It is designed not only to shame, but to warn the populace. charge against Jesus is sedition, and it is a public and gruesome form of execution. God's answer to the Roman Empire's execution of Jesus is to raise him from the dead. And almost immediately, the church becomes a pacifist movement as a result. Not only do Christians not execute anyone, they do not serve in the army, and they do not practice abortion or infanticide, otherwise common among their contemporaries. Now, clearly, that tradition of pacifism takes a lot of different turns in the ensuing centuries. By the 4th century already, conscientious objection to military service is no longer the rule among Christians. Then the Crusades demonstrate the church at its bloodiest. And so-called Christian Europe routinely executed offenders until the end of the 20th century. They don't anymore, you know. And no doubt, I suspect, that was because they knew one of the most problematic paragraphs in the New Testament, for my money, and that is the first 6 verses of Romans 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, Paul says, for there's no authority except from God. And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers, listen to this, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. If you wish to have no fear of the authority, then do what is good, and you'll receive its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Now, some people argue that Paul's being accommodationist here, so as not to appear dangerous to the empire. I have trouble seeing which imperial officials are going to read his letter to the churches in Rome, but that's an argument. Others say that Paul is flattering the empire and perhaps people who are loyal to it among the Roman Christians by saying that its authority derives from God, and this is a way to encourage Christians to a careful combination of submission to political authority and resistance to it, since ultimate loyalty always belongs to God. Still others worry that he is as naive as he appears on the surface of these words. I just can't help wondering, what does he think about Jesus' death when he says rulers are not a terror to good conduct but to bad? Paul knows full well that Rome executed Jesus. Even if at 1 Corinthians 2:8 he says they didn't know what they were doing. If they'd known he was the Lord of glory, they wouldn't have done it. I actually sort of prefer the slyly subversive expression of the same exhortation in 1 Peter 2. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. Doesn't that sound a lot like Romans 13? For it's God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Now here's the subversive part. Honor everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. It begins, honor everyone. And it ends, honor the emperor. So the emperor has rather slyly been demoted to be just like everybody else. Now I like that. I don't live in a context like 1 Peter. I'm actually live in a context much more like the Romans. But here are people with their backs against the wall, and their minister tells them, you can resist without being violent. You can resist the ultimate claims of the empire as being divine without getting yourself executed like Jesus was. I don't know what to do with Romans 13. And that's why finally for me, this multiplicity of voices in the Bible, with the numerous contexts within which the death penalty is prescribed in Torah, and the reality of Jesus' own death forces me to make theological judgments about how do I sort out these multiple voices. Which one gets to speak more loudly? And it's clear that for me, Jesus' death has to be the hermeneutical key. That God's answer to Jesus' execution is to raise him from the dead and to say no.